Welcome back. Now, as you might be aware, a lot of Exchange services, a lot of Exchange protocols work over HTTPS or SSL. And when the Exchange server is first installed, it is automatically set up with what is called a self-signed SSL certificate. So there's a SSL certificate that the server generates and assigns to itself. It hasn't come from a certificate authority. And that just allows the Exchange to be up and running with SSL-enabled services right from the start. But that SSL certificate that is self-signed is not really appropriate for ongoing use. So to demonstrate what I mean by that, I've got here my Windows 7 virtual machine. So this is basically a Windows 7 client that I've joined to my exchangebootcamp.com domain. And if I open the web browser and go to the webmail URL, for example, for the server, so HTTPS and then the fully qualified domain name of our server /OWA for Outlook Web App. You can see we get this warning message that there is a problem with the website security certificate. We can continue, and just having a look at that certificate, we see here that the CA root certificate is not trusted. To enable trust, install this certificate, etc., etc. So the issue there is that the certificate has been issued, or it is a self-signed certificate that has been issued by the Exchange server to itself, and my client computer does not trust that server to be a certificate authority. So what we need to do now is replace that certificate with one that is issued from a certificate authority. So let's come over to the Exchange server, and I'm back in the Exchange Admin Center again. On the left hand side, just click on to servers, and then along the top click on certificates. You can see there that self-signed certificate that is already assigned to the services IIS, SMTP and so on. So that's the certificate that we want to effectively replace with a SSL certificate that is from a trusted CA. So let's begin by creating a new certificate request. So I'll just click next to jump through there. We want to give the certificate a friendly name. I'm just going to call mine Exchange 2013. I'm not going to request a wildcard certificate in this case. I'm actually going to explicitly provide the namespaces that I want on the certificate. So I'll skip that. We need to store the certificate request on one of our Exchange servers, and I only have one server, so I can only choose that one. And now we get to specify the namespaces that will be included in the certificate. Now, it doesn't matter too much what you put here, because you do get a chance on the next dialog to actually clean up and replace any of the ones that are in there. So you can, if you were to configure individual URLs for different services, you can do that here. For example, I can say that my Outlook Web App namespace is exchange mail.exchangebootcamp.com. Okay, and that would now appear in the list on the next screen here. You can see that's now in there, as well as the server's fully qualified domain name, the auto-discovered namespace, the server's NetBIOS name, and the domain name itself. Now, there are a few best practices around these certificates for Exchange. Microsoft recommends that you do not include the server's fully qualified domain name. So we're going to remove that one. And you can no longer request SSL certificates that include names for domains that cannot be verified or validated online. So short server names or NetBIOS names are also excluded. And in this case, we're just going to get rid of this because we don't really need it. So what we're left with is mail.exchangebootcamp.com, which is the namespace I've decided to use for all of my client access services such as webmail and Outlook Anywhere, and the auto-discovered namespace as well. So with just the two of those names, we'll continue and fill out the details here, the organization name, Okay, so just fill those out. If you're using your private certificate authority within your test lab, like I will be doing here, these details are not too important. If you're planning to purchase a certificate from a commercial CA, these details are more important. And they typically need to match the information, the who is information on your for your registered domain. If they don't match, then you may find that your certificate does not get automatically approved. You may need to fill out a form or provide some other information before you get your SSL certificate. But just for a private CA like I'm doing here, not that important. And now we need to provide a location to save the certificate request. Now this is actually a UNC path, not a local drive on the server. The reason for that is you can imagine you could be running this web console, this Exchange Admin Center from anywhere. You could be running it from your administrative workstation or another non-Exchange server. And so you really need to provide a UNC path where the Exchange server can write that certificate request. Now, one of the best places to put it is actually on an Exchange server. So I'm going to put it on my Exchange server in the C drive in an admin folder that I've created there already. And I'll just call it cert request.rec, which is pretty close to the name that it suggests you use there anyway. The name is not really that important. Just make sure it's something that you will recognize when you go and look for it later in Windows Explorer. All right, click finish, and that's it. Now you'll see that the certificate request sits here in a pending request status. And if we jump over to Explorer and go to C admin, there is my certificate request. Now you can open that up in Notepad. You can see all that information there, which is not very useful just reading that on its own, but that is basically the certificate request. And what we want to do now is go to the Certificate Services web enrollment page on the domain controller where we installed Certificate Services and submit that request there. So we'll go to HTTP EBC DC1 cert SRV, request a certificate using advanced certificate request, submit a certificate request using a etc. And we end up on this page here. Now the certificate template to choose is web server, and then just take all that information that was in the certificate request and copy that, paste it in there, and click submit. And it may take a few moments for this to appear, but basically that certificate has now been issued by my CA, and I can download that. And here it is here, cert new. So what I'm going to do is just move that back to the C admin folder where I can find it again. All right, back to the Exchange Admin Center. We now need to complete this pending certificate request. So down here you see the link to complete it. We'll kick that off. Again, it's a UNC path to that certificate file. certnew.cer. It's as simple as that. That certificate request is now complete and it comes up with a status of valid. Now the last step is that we haven't actually assigned that certificate to any services. So if I was to go back and connect now to webmail or to the Exchange Admin Center from another machine, I'll still have that untrusted certificate issue popping up because I haven't assigned my new certificate to those services. So just highlight that certificate and click on edit and go to the click on the services link there, and we'll assign it to SMTP, IMAP, POP and IIS. You get a warning about overriding the existing default SMTP certificate. That's fine, you can click yes for that. There we go. Alright, back to my Windows 7 computer. So here's the web browser window that I had open earlier. Now let's see what happens when we try that now. Okay, we're still a problem with the website security certificate, so we continue. And let's have a look this time. Now, we haven't got the trust issue in this case. So what's the issue? Well, the issue is that we're connecting to ebcex1.exchangebootcamp.com, but the name on the certificate is mail.exchangebootcamp.com. So the problem now is not a trust issue, it's actually a name mismatch issue. Okay, so that's another reason that a certificate warning may appear. So having chosen mail.exchangebootcamp.com as the namespace for all of our exchange services, we actually now need to go and configure those services to use that name. And we can do all of that in PowerShell back on the Exchange server. Now there are actually 7 places where we need to configure that, so I'll just clear my screen up a little bit. So we need to configure this namespace for Outlook Anywhere, Outlook Web App, the Exchange Control Panel, ActiveSync, Exchange Web Services, the Offline Address Book, and Auto Discover. So there's 7 in total. Now they may sound complicated, but it's actually quite simple. So let's step through it now. I will say that you can do some of these using the Exchange Admin Center. You can do it through that web interface, but I think there's value in learning how to do this using PowerShell. And it's, the more tasks that you can do in PowerShell, the better. The more you'll learn about PowerShell that way. So let's start with Outlook Anywhere. First, we'll have a look at the URLs that are currently configured, the host names that are currently configured on the server for Outlook Anywhere. So I will just select server and host names. I'll format that in a list just for easier reading. Alright, so there's no external host name and there's an internal host name, which is just the server's fully qualified domain name. No problem, so let's configure that to use our mail.exchangebootcamp.com for both the internal and external namespaces. So now, if there were multiple servers in the organization, you would actually need to specify the server here, so I will do that just for the sake of clarity. Now we use set Outlook Anywhere to actually make the change. We'll set the external hostname to mail.exchangebootcamp.com, the internal hostname to mail.exchangebootcamp.com as well. We also need to specify whether we want internal and external clients to use SSL or not. So we'll say external clients require SSL true and internal clients require SSL false. Although if you want it to be really secure, you could say true. And a default authentication method of NTLM. And the other option there is basic, but NTLM, that's what I'm going to use here. Alright, so that's the first one down. Looks like a long command, but it's quite simple. We're just configuring Outlook Anywhere to use that external hostname, that internal hostname, and setting the SSL requirement for both internal and external connections, and also the authentication method to NTLM. It's just that simple. There's nothing really complicated there. So let's move on now to OWA, Outlook Web App. So the same thing again, we'll look at the OWA virtual directory settings for the URLs. Okay, we've got an internal URL, once again, server fully qualified domain name and no external URL. Okay, so set OWA virtual directory. External URL, https mail.exchangebootcamp.com. OWA, internal URL of the same. And we get a warning there that we should do the same change for the Exchange Control Panel, or ECP, virtual directory. So no problem, let's do that right now. So it's mail.exchangebootcamp.com/ECP in this case. Internal URL is the same. Okay, let's move on to the next one, which is Exchange ActiveSync. So we'll get the ActiveSync virtual directory, and let's have a look at the URLs already there. Okay, so we've got server fully qualified domain name / Microsoft Server ActiveSync. So we will get ActiveSync virtual directory. Let's get that one wrong. External URL. Let's see if we can speed things up here with a bit of copy paste. And internal URL. Oops, I have a double period there. Thought I was making things easier. It turns out I introduced an error. Alright, we're getting there. Next, let's do the Exchange Web Services virtual directory. So this is the virtual directory that is used for, well, Exchange Web Services, which is the programming API. And for auto discover and auto configuration, the availability service and things like that. So let's have a look at the current settings again. Okay, so get web services virtual directory for this server, and then set web services virtual directory external URL. There's a warning there about that name not being resolvable. That's because we haven't actually added a DNS record for it yet, so don't worry too much about that. We'll move on now to the offline address book. So get OAB virtual directory. Okay, that's a nice simple one. So that was just get OAB virtual directory, and then pipe that into set OAB virtual directory. So by now you're probably getting quite familiar with those internal and external URL parameters. The last one we need to do is the auto discover service connection point. Now this one's a little bit of a trap. I'll show you what I mean. So we've got the auto discover virtual directory. And you can see there's no URLs actually configured there at all. Now, some people think that you need to configure URLs, internal and external URLs, on your auto-discover virtual directory, but you actually do not need to do that. So the virtual directory has those attributes because it comes from a common schema, like all of the virtual directories have those attributes. But in the case of the auto-discover virtual directory, they are just ignored. They are not used at all. And in fact, what we need to do is set the auto-discover SCP on the client access server itself. So let's have a look at get client access server, and we'll look at the URI, not URL in this case. And we can see that the auto-discover service internal URI is actually set there on the client access server. So I will copy this one to my clipboard, and we'll get client access server and set client access server auto-discover service internal URI, and I'm going to use the auto-discover namespace. Paste the rest of that in. Okay, that's the last namespace we have to configure. Now, that might have seemed like a lot of typing, and yeah, it was a few minutes work. It's worth doing that at least once, I think, on manually on your own, just to understand that each of those things needs to be configured, and you'll very quickly realize if you've missed one later on when you do some testing. So this gives you a little bit of familiarity with these options and these different configurations, so you can actually learn a few things and go back and do some testing and troubleshooting. If you wanted to get a bit more adventurous, you could by all means go ahead and develop yourself a script that could do all this for you. If you plan to deploy multiple client access servers where you'll be doing this configuration across multiple servers, by all means go ahead and learn how to script that sort of task. And that's exactly what you should be doing with PowerShell scripts, is actually looking for these repeatable type tasks that you can automate and make more efficient. But certainly there's some value in doing it at least once, I think, the long way, like I've just demonstrated there. Now, the last thing that you should do, because you've made a whole bunch of changes to virtual directories, is just reset IIS on the server. So we can do that just by simply running IIS reset. Alright, that's successfully restarted. We need to add that DNS record. So going back to my domain controller, which is also a DNS server, we'll just crack open the DNS console. And we need to add 2 records pointing at the IP address of our Exchange server. So in my case, that's 192.168.0.32. So I'm going to add a host record for mail. And a host record for auto discover as well. I'll just make sure those are resolving correctly. That's all good. Okay. Let's go back to the Windows 7 client and test all that out and see how well we did. So mail.exchangebootcamp.com/OWA. We'll see if webmail works. And there we go. This time it loads up with no certificate warnings. So that name is now resolving in DNS. And when the client makes an SSL connection to the Exchange server, the name matches and the certificate is trusted. And the certificate is also valid in as far as it has not expired yet. And we get no problems at all. Let's see if the same applies to Outlook. Okay, all green ticks there, that's good. Restart Outlook, no problem. Okay, all logged in there without any certificate warnings or errors. And we can even do the tests here. So we'll do the test email auto configuration. And there we go. Look at the URLs that it's discovered. mail.exchangebootcamp.com, mail.exchangebootcamp.com. All these different URLs that we configured are now showing up correctly. Okay, so that's the end of this lesson. So what we did was we discussed how SSL certificates work, demonstrated why the self-signed certificate for the Exchange server is not going to be generally appropriate for ongoing use, walked through the process of creating a certificate request on the Exchange server and then completing that certificate request using our private certificate authority, assigning that certificate to services on the Exchange server, and then walking through configuring each of those services to use the namespace that we chose, mail.exchangebootcamp.com in this case, for use in Exchange, and then finally tested that using Outlook Web Access and also Outlook, and verified that everything looks set up correctly. We've configured all those namespaces correctly, the certificate is trusted, matches those names, and there's basically no errors that would pop up for the end user in this case.